This is a day when we all remember or tell the story of where you were on 9/11/2001, and for New Yorkers that is indeed etched in many of our minds. And for those who are much younger, they will hear the stories from their parents, just like I heard the stories of where was I on the day that JFK was shot. I missed that one by about 11 months, but I remember I was at a Paulist Fathers General Council meeting out in Jamaica Estates that day, out in Queens, and we were already in the basement where we had our meeting room, if you can believe that. We used to call it the bunker, and it turned out to be that way that day, as we were getting information about what was happening. And Father DiCiano, God love him, was so insistent that whatever was happening in the world that day, we had to pass the budget for the Paulist Fathers before we could do anything else. We were in that bunker of the basement all morning, and every now and then, one of the fathers would rush down the steps. Father Ed Whitley, now deceased, he was about 85 at the time, who kept telling us all this horrible news that was happening outside the door. And since it was his birthday, the first thing we did when the meeting was over is I went over to the Carvel ice cream store to pick up Father's birthday cake, still not knowing that there was no World Trade Center building any longer. Talk about shock when I finally got back to look at the TV, and I said, what happened? Where's the building? Where did it go? We had missed the whole thing. It was a very surreal experience, but I also remember how calm it was outside, except for fighter jets going overhead. You might remember that. I remember coming back on the subway train back into Manhattan that evening on the F train and coming up the escalator at the stop at 53rd Street. And coming up the escalator, coming down the escalator were workers from the World Trade Center area, covered with soot, coming down the escalator to get on the train to go to Queens. Those trains were still running at that hour. It was frightening. And only to emerge up to 3rd Avenue and 53rd Street on a bright September day after Labor Day when things should have been bustling, and there looked like there was tumbleweeds going across 3rd Avenue at that hour. It was very intense, and the only time now I had a shudder about 5 months ago when I walked out after March 17th to discover that 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue were as desolate as it was on 9/11. And I had that shudder all over again. We don't forget. These memories stay in our bones. And the good news for New York, at least 19 years later, and it's a memory hopefully that serves us today, is that we as a city pulled together in an unbelievable fashion, gathered with one another in church here and other places, among one another, to grieve and to mourn and to struggle. The city's economy was shattered for a month or so, but slowly things came back. We still remember, but we made it through. And I think New York was a model. I think after 9/11, I think the crime problems of New York totally reversed because people realized that how much we needed each other and how much we had to stop fighting with each other maybe in our city. It taught us a lot of lessons that we still live and are thankful for today, despite the loss of those 3,000 people who perished that day, and people who are still suffering today. The first responders who rushed to a scene that is now causing many of them to be ill. We give thanks. And it reminds us in this day, with the pandemic we're going through, to remind us once again that we will survive this. God will walk us through this tragedy as well. The economy is probably shattered more than it was after 9/11, but we will perdure and persevere. And why do I say this with such confidence? And how do any of us say it with such confidence? It's because why we are here. We are here because we trust in God's providence. We trust the Lord sends wisdom, sends helpers into the difficulty. As we've seen again during the pandemic, those who risked their lives, sometimes just being a grocery clerk, or more especially by being in the hospital on the front lines of the pandemic. We've seen how our city has once again been stilled by this time, just maybe like it was in 9/11, an invisible enemy of someone we didn't see who's doing this to us. But we know, thanks to God, that we're better than all of that. That God puts that in our hearts, brings out the goodness, brings out the caring, brings out the trust once we move through the darkness. So my friends, on 9/11, I would say that God removed a giant plank from our eyes, the plank that sometimes helps us forget how much we mean to one another as a city. Strangers become allies all of a sudden, and we're reminded how we need to keep removing that plank from our eyes that helps us see Christ in our midst, Christ in the adversity, Christ in the struggle and in the challenge. If we can remove that plank from our eye that wants the plank of fear or grievance or anger, remove that plank to see the plank that is love and connection and possibility, then we can really help someone else who, in the darkness of pandemic or the darkness of fear, of whatever it might be, to see the greatness of God and to trust in His abiding care. To our St. Paul's community who still remember the loss of Debbie Welsh and other parishioners here, our condolences to you, our prayers to you. 19 years on this day is like nothing. And in the grace of God, it is something we know that you are with us in spirit, especially those who have gone before us. May the Lord continue to guide and protect our city and protect all those who care for us in essential services and first responders. We are so grateful.